Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. And in today's video, I'm going to help out one of the students. I think it was Eason in the Facebook group had asked a question related to the terms antagonist, agonist, and he had actually took a screenshot of the question or on one of the quizzes. Fairly straightforward question about it, tells you the exercise and speaks to the concentric contraction of that particular exercise, and then throws in the term agonist and antagonist. And so his question, and it's a good question, it's asked quite often by students, is how do I differentiate or how do I memorize? Again, look, the idea of how do I memorize or learn something, remember, that is a study technique. The ability to learn and understand information starts out with memorization. So you got to memorize the terms, and I can help you do that. But that's something that just takes time. There's no magic trick to putting together concentric, agonist, eccentric, antagonist, isometric, whatever the terms are. You've got to memorize what the terms mean, and then depending on your learning style, if you want to think of it like that, to really get it to sink into your gray matter, you got to study a certain way. So there are different ways you can do this. Again, as a preliminary to any video on how to deal with the ACE material, first thing you got to do is remember there's just going to be a bunch of questions. And so I want to bring up what the actual question was. And you can see during the concentric portion of a seated leg extension, which muscle group is performing as the agonist. So what do we have here? Concentric. So look at the terms. Concentric contraction, right? So there's one term, right? So that's one thing you got to know. What is a concentric contraction? Well, a lot of this material is in chapter 9. In this particular instance, for instance, muscle function on page 340 speaks to agonist, prime mover, things like that. So, but just keep in mind, before I come over and kind of do some of this stuff on paper, concentric is one term. So if you don't know what the term concentric means, you got to go back and study concentric, right? You're not going to get this question right unless you actually know the definition of a concentric contraction. And again, if you are a visual learner and you can read it and memorize it, understand it by reading the material, then you can simply read it, rewrite it over and over until that definition sits in your brain, right? A concentric contraction means that the muscle, whatever muscle is being concentrically contracted, is being shortened under tension. That's the strict definition. However you want to add or make a little bit more interesting, that's the definition. That's when a muscle shortens under tension. Period. Okay. It's the opposite of an eccentric contraction, which is when a muscle lengthens under tension. Okay. So that's one term in the question. So concentric portion. Okay. Well, here's an exercise. By the way, if you don't exercise and work out with weights, you're going to have a challenge with some of these most basic common exercises or machines that we see in the average health club, gym, in some cases, personal training studios, not often, but gyms. So a leg extension machine. So if you don't know what a leg extension machine is, that's something else you need to memorize. And you're going to get that in some of the later chapters in the textbook. So a leg extension machine is a seated piece of equipment. The resistance load is placed at the foot, and you essentially contract the quadriceps. Quadriceps go through a shortening phase, and the weight lifts up and out. For most people, you've seen this. If not, you better get into the gym and start looking at some of these exercises, because they are standard common exercises that the average personal training client, especially one-on-one training clients in a health club, will definitely be using. So there's one, concentric, two, seated leg extension. You got to know the exercises and the names of the exercises. Once again, let's step back. How do you memorize that? Well, you write it down, and you can draw a picture of it if you wanted to. If you are a visual learner, if you're an audiological learner, if you are a tactile learner, you're going to add on these specific elements of study that will help you in that particular arena in which you understand and and memorize information. So if you're a visual learner, a seated leg extension, you could read it, rewrite it, and then look at a picture of it and go on YouTube or whatever and look at somebody performing a leg extension. That's why YouTube is great. So you can go in and actually look. Don't worry about them performing the positive and whatever. Just know what the leg extension is. Once you see it performed, a visual learner goes, oh, I get it. Got it. Now, a tactile learner, it's probably a good idea as a tactile learner to do what? Well, you got to read it, say it out loud, right? And maybe draw pictures of it. But if you're a tactile learner, ultimately what you have to do is say, okay, leg extension. And you sit down and you actually do the movement, extend the foot out, lock the knee at the top, and that's a leg extension. So the exercise equipment would be, you would mimic that. And that's how a tactile learner would kind of get the additional benefit according to their learning style. So audiological, you'd be saying it out loud. Okay, leg extension. You might just listen to this video, for instance, and not watch me or watch anything because the visual component of learning is just not as strong in that case. So audiologically, you would say, okay, what is a leg extension? You start thinking about it and you would say it out loud, or you would listen to somebody saying, start with your foot in this position. You kind of get an imaginary, you kind of imagine what it looks like in your head. This is great for audiological learners, by the way. And then you kind of explain it through and say it out loud to yourself. Okay, you're going to go ahead and put your feet and lock. Okay, so that gives you the leg extension term right here. So concentric, got to know what that means. Seated leg extension. Which muscle group is performing as, and here it is. There it is. There's the term. So don't worry so much about the answers yet. What do you got? Concentric contraction. You got to know what that means. Of course, the exercise. And then agonist antagonist. And this is where, if you're not familiar with some of the, more sort of esoteric terms that are used in kinesiology, biomechanics, yeah, I get it. So how do you do it? Well, let me show you real quick what I've done over and over. And one of the best ways to do this, and you'll notice that I have colored pencils. Now, look, just keep in mind, I'm using these because I have a visual tactile component, very tactile, but I got visual. So I can actually read and learn very easily. So if I'm trying to learn the definitions of certain terms, I'm going to use colored markers. I will use pens. I'll use anything now that's going to help me to get some more visual stimulation while I'm doing it. And again, I've got my book, my textbook. If you have the digital version, that's fine as well. In this case, on this particular question that was asked, you're going to be in chapter 9, Foundations and Benefits of Muscular Training. Page 340 talks about muscle function. That is essentially where you're going to see, right? You're going to see these terms. So agonist, prime mover, right? And you're going to get crazy because you're saying, oh, how am I going to memorize all that? Well, it's really pretty straightforward. Now, I can give you the definitions, but generally the way I try to help students understand the connection between concentric, eccentric, agonist, and antagonist is to make sure you have a clear distinction between what they are. Concentric and eccentric, those terms isometric, what do they refer to? They refer to the way the muscle acts under tension, right? Concentric contractions. How does the muscle act while it's under tension? I'm just going to bring you back up here. During a concentric contraction, the muscle shortens. Okay, forget about the joint. Forget about all that. Make sure that when you're studying and trying to understand some of these concepts, if it doesn't come to you, you've got to break it down and come into this little world of definitions. And in this case, we're talking about the kinesiology and the way the muscles actually function under load. Concentric simply means that the muscle is shortening under tension. Eccentric, muscle is lengthening under tension. My recommendation then is, when you're going through and trying to study this and learn this from a question like that, now go ahead and try and wrap your brain around, for all the different muscles of your body, what does it mean for that muscle to be in a concentric contraction or an eccentric contraction? Go ahead and grab your pen and write down your muscles. Biceps. This is just a little trick. What happens when the biceps concentrically contracts? What's the movement that occurs? Well, the bicep muscle, which is right here, if it shortens under tension, what does it do? It does this, yes? You better do that over and over again. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Do it for your triceps. Do it for your deltoids. Write it down. Write it down. Say it to yourself, and then do it. Biceps shorten, biceps lengthen. Concentric, eccentric. Biceps shorten, biceps lengthen. And get that down. Deltoids, my shoulders. Deltoids shorten and lift the arm out to the side. Abduction. Deltoids lengthen and allow for adduction. Pectoralis major. And the pectoralis major shortens, it flexes, internally rotates. Okay. You could also say yes, horizontal adduction. Yes, there's terms like that you need to memorize, but write that down. And then write down what that definition, if you want to write down biceps shortens, you could say elbow flexion, right? You would need to know that anyway, but keep it simple. When the bicep concentrically contracts, pulls the hand up, we call that elbow flexion, right? Eccentric contraction is when if the bicep lengthens under tension, right? So that's the lowering part of, say, a dumbbell curl. That's how you learn concentric, eccentric. Just look at the major muscles of the body and do it. And do it. The physicality of it may be the key that helps you to get it. Okay. Now that you've got concentric and eccentric, I hope. Now I come over and I've got to grapple with, I've got to contend with some other terms. And some really important terms that ACE wants you to know, as it's important that you know this, are the terms agonist, and what? Antagonist. Okay. So now what do these terms mean? Forget about this. You got this. I'm going to pull these two together, but agonist and antagonist now describes movement of muscles. Okay. Generally, it's going to describe movement of muscles in conjunction with each other, coupling pairs, muscles that work opposite each other around the joint. Remember, the concentric and eccentric concepts apply just to the muscle itself. Just the muscle. Forget about the joints. Forget about anything else. It's when a muscle shortens and a muscle lengthens. Agonist and antagonist that concept now adds in the idea that when a muscle actually shortens and lengthens, it actually does something to a joint. Does that make sense? Okay. Now you step from just pure physiology into kinesiology for the most part, right? So human movement. That's the big difference. Of course, how do you bring that together? Well, if you understand the definition of agonist and antagonist, now we can start to piece together concentric and eccentric. What is the definition of agonist? It simply means that muscle that you're shortening and lengthening, that muscle that's working to create a particular movement itself. Okay. So if I do a dumbbell curl, right? Don't worry about the fact that my arm is moving up and down, but the fact that it's my bicep that is providing the force to cause movement means that my bicep during this movement pattern is what we call the agonist. It is the muscle responsible for the particular movement that you're doing. Hope that makes sense. This is where it gets confusing because you'll get a question related to the same exact movement pattern, meaning elbow flexion and extension. However, it's very different when I'm holding a dumbbell and I lift the dumbbell this way versus, watch this, I put the dumbbell down and I go over and I grab a cable machine and I push down this way. That makes sense? It's a different movement. I mean, from a kinesiological perspective, it's flexion and extension. The only difference is where the force, right, the line of force is being applied. Either with a dumbbell, force goes down, or a cable machine where the force goes up, right? So the agonist is the muscle responsible for the particular movement that you're doing. That's it, agonist, agonist. That's the way I always think about it. That's the main guy, right? The agonist is the main muscle. It's the prime mover. It's doing the actual movement. This is how you memorize this. Again, just like you did with the concentric eccentric contractions, and you looked at the muscle and said, well, the muscle. Now look at any exercise. That's the way you study agonists and antagonists. Now look at any exercise and ask yourself a question. When you go into the gym, why do you do lateral raises? Why do you do shoulder dumbbell presses? Why do you do push downs? Why do you do bench presses? What muscles do they work? Right? When you do a squat, what are you trying to work when you do squats? Why do you do squats in a gym? To train your quads. I know your glutes are working, your hams. Yeah, of course. But primarily it's your quadriceps. So during a squat, what muscle group is the agonist? What muscle group is responsible for the primary movement? Yes, I know your erector spinae and your gluteal group are responsible for a major part of squats, but that's not don't think so much that academic, but think in the real world, because that's what they're going to ask you the questions on. So squats work the quads, right? That's the primary. So what is the agonist? The quadriceps. Hope that makes sense. So if you're doing a particular exercise, and that's how, again, that's how you would study. Literally, I would have a student write this down. Give me an exercise. Push-ups. Okay, and you write down push-ups. What is the agonist? What is the primary move? What is the primary muscle? Why do we do push-ups? Yes, I know your triceps work. Yes, I know your deltoids work, but that's not, would you just pick one? It's the pecs, the pectoralis major, right? That's the agonist in that exercise. Yes, I know compound and isolation movements make it a little confusing. That's why ACE will probably ask you a question on agonist antagonist that is a isolation movement requiring a single joint going through a single particular range of motion for whatever degrees of freedom it has. That's why the easiest question for them to ask, whether you know it or not, is the elbow or the knee, something like that. Okay, so you know what the agonist is. What is the antagonist? On any joint of your body, every single joint of your body, major joints that we talk about, your shoulders, your cervical, right, spine, cervical, right, your spinal column itself, hips, pelvis, knees, ankles, elbows, wrists, all have muscles that work against each other to create the opposing movement. So the muscle group or muscle that does the exact opposite of the kinesiological function of the agonist is called the antagonist. This is about as simple as it gets, folks. And this is the way you study this. Look at the joint. Look at your elbow joint. What are the two muscles responsible for moving the elbow joint through ranges of motion, right? Either up or down. What are the two muscles? Biceps, triceps. Get it? What about the knee? Quadriceps, hamstrings. Hips, abdominals, hip flexors, right? Erector spinae would be the opposing muscle groups, gluteus maximus. By the way, this is what helps you understand the oppositional components during overactive, underactive situations when you're looking at postural distortion issues, okay? So agonist is the primary mover. Antagonist is the opposite muscle to what that muscle does. And again, classic muscle pairings for agonists and antagonists are going to be quads and hamstrings, right? Biceps and triceps. So the question, a particular question that you get that asks, if this is happening, which during this exercise, you see, remember what that question asked? Concentric, leg extensions, agonist or antagonist, right? You got those three components. Now you should be able to answer it. Pretty straightforward. If during this particular exercise, this is the contraction that's occurring, either a concentric or eccentric, they can ask you an eccentric, what muscle is responsible for that? Okay. You would know what the opposing muscle is. So let's go back to the question. I'll pull this up. And I hope this makes sense. During the concentric portion of a seated, okay, so what's the exercise? The seated leg extension. Okay. During the concentric portion of the seated leg extension, what muscle is responsible for knee extension. It's a leg extension machine, so it's the knee. What muscle is responsible for knee extension during the concentric phase of its contraction? Well, it's the quadricep, right? Concentric is shortening. During the shortening portion, which muscle group shortens during a seated leg extension? That's how you would read this. Which muscle group, concentric portion, which muscle group is shortening during a seated leg extension? It's the quadricep, right? I hope everyone knows that. It's the quadricep. So during the concentric portion of a seated leg extension, the quadricep is shortening. Therefore, it is the what? It's the agonist. If you got to rewind this video and go back to everything I just explained to you, please do so. The muscle that is shortening, the concentric portion of the seated leg extension, because that is the primary mover that is under tension, under load. It is causing the actual movement. The concentric portion or the concentric contraction, the positive, is generally what is causing the particular movement to occur at the joint. Okay. Concentric of a seated leg extension, which muscle group is the antagonist? Well, we just said this defined for you what the agonist was, right? The agonist is the quadricep. What is the opposing or opposite muscle group? It's the hamstring, correct? And therefore, that's the answer to the question. Let's do this. During the concentric portion of a dumbbell curl, see what I did? During the concentric portion of a side lateral raise, listen to this. During the concentric portion of a lying leg curl, you with me? I just told you what the agonistic muscle is, didn't I? During the concentric portion of blah, 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 I just told you what the agonist was. All you got to do is then say, well, I know that the bicep and the tricep are opposing pairs on the elbow. Does that make sense? Now watch. See if you can answer this. During the concentric portion of a dumbbell curl, get that? During the concentric portion of a dumbbell curl, which muscle is acting as the antagonist? During the concentric portion of a dumbbell curl, which muscle is acting as the antagonist? Well, the bicep. During the concentric portion of a dumbbell curl, the bicep is the prime mover. It's the agonist. Therefore, the opposing muscle is the antagonist. What would be the answer? The triceps. Okay, now watch. Hang on. During the concentric portion of a tricep pushdown, what muscle is acting as the antagonist? What is it? During the concentric portion of a tricep pushdown, what muscle is responsible for pushing the cable down? What is the agonistic muscle? It's the tricep. Therefore, in the bicep-tricep pair, the bicep obviously is the antagonist. You should do this with every joint on the body, so to speak, to really understand it. If you're doing, again, the knee and the elbow are the easiest because generally there's a single degree of freedom. They have basically one coupling pair that they use, flexion, extension, versus more complicated joints such as the shoulder and the hip. So, but they could ask you those questions. By the way, they could flip some of those terms around. Remember, we were looking at the question that said during the concentric portion. They could ask you during the eccentric portion of a lying leg curl. During the eccentric portion, what is the antagonistic muscle? By the way, it's going to be the same, right? Because the quadricep is the opposing muscle to the hamstring. The exercise essentially told you what the primary or agonist muscle is. During a side lateral raise, I don't have to say anything else to you. What is the agonistic muscle during a side lateral raise? What is it? It's the deltoid. You get it? I hope that makes sense. So that's how you deal with those terms. Concentric, eccentric, Learn that, understand that, because you can apply that information then to the more broad concept of agonist versus antagonist. This also helps, obviously, when we talk about synergistic muscles and other concepts that they have. And I don't want to go into that in this particular video, but I hope this was helpful. Remember, there's a couple of sort of rabbit trails to go down here. The question was, can anybody help me to understand? Well, as soon as I hear a question like that from a student, I'm thinking that individual, like many of us, have a conceptual issue going on. There's a 3-dimension. And that also means that perhaps there's not enough understanding of the basic concepts. You get it? You got to have a basic foundation of information. By the way, that's why Quizlet is so helpful, because it helps you with the definitions. Concentric is what? Muscle shortens under tension. Eccentric is what? You ought to be able to spit that one out like that. Antagonist, agonist, you should be able to spit out the definition of the agonist just like that. That is the prime movement. It's the muscle responsible for the particular movement that we're talking about. What's the antagonistic muscle? You should spit that out just like that. It is the opposing muscle to the agonist. Does that make sense? So when the agonist shortens, the antagonistic lengthens. Now, just so you understand, the agonist is the one that's under tension. The antagonist isn't. Okay? During a dumbbell curl, the bicep is under tension, but the tricep actually has to relax. So the agonist can be under tension, but the antagonist is not. Hope that makes sense. Please keep in mind, I'm just going to give you one more quick thing. Concentric and eccentric contractions. The term contraction means the muscle in question is under tension. Concentric simply means that it's shortening under tension. Eccentric means that it's lengthening under tension. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Get those two down, and you should be able to answer any question like this. The goal is to help you to pass the ACE exam on the first attempt. If you've already taken it and you failed, whatever you got on it, remember they would have told you what your domains were where you did poorly on. Those are the areas that you would focus on the most. And then as you're going through the material, if you are struggling with any of this, that's what you want to post in the Facebook group. Again, Eason did a great job he posted, but make it specific so that we can hone in on it, just like I did with this video today. The goal is to, when you post, make it so that we can really target, go to that area of the textbook and nail it for you, so that you don't have any issues with the next time you take a practice exam. And then, of course, when you take the actual exam itself, you pass. We want to see you, when you pass, showing everybody your certificate. And just let us know if you have questions. Remember, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, the subscribing helps you to get access to that material. And then also you can hit that bell, and you can get notifications every time new material comes out. I hope, again, that this was helpful. Leave your comments below and let us know how we can answer more questions related to this particular topic or anything in the ACE 6th edition textbook. Have a great weekend. Thanks.